The observation deck of the Cretan warship Endless Dominion hummed with the familiar vibrations of deep space combat readiness. Commander Zalthor stood before the viewport, his three-fingered hands clasped behind his carapace-covered back, watching the small human vessel limp through the debris field. For 6 cycles, the Cretan hegemony had swept across this sector, encountering species after species, each one crumbling before their superior firepower and tactical precision. The humans were supposed to be no different. Intelligence reports had described them as fragile, short-lived creatures who relied on primitive kinetic weapons and barely understood the fundamental principles of quantum shielding. Yet here, in the dying light of a red giant star, Zalthor was about to learn that intelligence reports could be catastrophically wrong. The human ship had refused to surrender despite being outgunned, outmanned, and critically damaged. Its hull bore the scars of a dozen plasma strikes, atmosphere venting from at least 3 major breaches, yet its engines still burned defiantly against the cosmic darkness. Zalthor had seen this pattern before, the desperate final moments before a species accepted the inevitable. He'd ordered his boarding parties to prepare, expecting the usual scene: trembling survivors huddled in corners, weapons abandoned, eyes filled with the hollow recognition of defeat. The Crethians were masters of this moment, having perfected the art of conquest over 700 planetary systems. They understood the mathematics of despair, the precise calculation of when a species will finally break. But as the magnetic clamps secured the human vessel to the Endless Dominion and the cutting torches began their work on the airlock, Zalthor felt something unusual, a flutter of uncertainty in his primary nerve cluster that he couldn't quite identify or explain. The first boarding team consisted of 12 Cretan shock troopers, each one a veteran of countless engagements, their exoskeletons enhanced with servomotors that multiplied their already formidable strength 5-fold. They carried plasma rifles capable of reducing organic matter to its constituent atoms in microseconds. The team leader, Subcommander Krelinake, had personally overseen 83 successful boarding actions without losing a single soldier. His tactical records were studied in military academies across the hegemony. As the airlock door finally gave way, with a screech of tortured metal, the troopers flooded into the human ship's corridor, their weapons sweeping the darkness, their helmet displays painting the interior in thermal gradients and tactical overlays. The corridor was narrow, clearly designed for creatures much smaller than Crethians, forcing them into a single-file formation that Krelinake disliked but accepted as temporary. Emergency lighting bathed everything in crimson, and the air tasted of burning plastic and recycled oxygen pushed far past its recommended limits. They found him 30 meters in, standing alone in a junction where 3 corridors met. A single human, male by the anatomical markers Krelinake's briefing had outlined, wearing what appeared to be a damaged pressure suit with the helmet removed. He held no weapon. His hands hung loosely at his sides. In the thermal display, his body temperature registered as elevated, his heart rate visible as a pulsing rhythm in his chest cavity, faster than Cretan baseline, but steady, controlled. The human's face was bleeding from a gash above his left eye, the crimson liquid running down his cheek and dripping onto his chest plate, but his expression showed neither fear nor surrender. Instead, something else entirely resided in those forward-facing predator eyes, something that made Krelinake's training suddenly feel inadequate. The human spoke, his voice carrying easily in the confined space despite the poor atmospheric pressure. "You should leave this ship. You should leave this system. You should return to whatever hole you crawled from, and tell them that humanity does not kneel." Krelinake's translator unit processed the words instantly, but the subcommander dismissed them with the contempt they deserved. Threats from a defeated enemy were nothing new, the final impotent rage of those about to be erased from the galactic stage. He raised his plasma rifle, the targeting system automatically compensating for the reduced gravity, and fired. The bolt of superheated plasma crossed the distance in a fraction of a second, striking the human square in the chest with enough energy to vaporize the torso of any biological entity Krelin had ever encountered. The impact should have been instantly fatal, the human's vital organs reduced to ash, his body blown backwards into the bulkhead behind him. But that's not what happened. The human staggered, his suit's chest plate glowing white-hot where the plasma had struck, smoke rising from the point of impact, but he did not fall. Instead, impossibly, horrifyingly, the human looked down at his chest, at the molten crater in his suit's armor, at the flesh beneath that should not have existed anymore, and then he looked back up at Krelin. And he laughed. The sound
The enemy
that
is near.
emerged from
Stay
the
vigilant.
human's throat
Yes, Commander.
was unlike anything
For the
in
mission.
Krelin extensive combat experience. It wasn't the hysterical laughter of a mind broken by trauma, nor the defiant cackle of someone who'd accepted death. This was something rawer, more primal, edged with genuine amusement and an undertone of pity that sent alarm signals cascading through Krelin neural pathways. The human took a step forward, just one step, his boots clanging against the metal decking, and that single movement carried more threat than an entire battalion charging across an open field. Krelin fired again, and this time the rest of his team joined him, 12 plasma rifles discharging in a coordinated volley that lit the corridor like a miniature sun. The concentrated firepower was enough to breach light armor plating, to reduce a Cretan warrior to scattered atoms, to punch through bulkheads and decompress entire sections of a ship. The human disappeared in a blinding flash of white light and superheated air, and for a moment Krelin allowed himself to believe that physics had finally reasserted itself, that biology had returned to its proper rules. But as the light faded and the smoke began to clear, the human was still there. His suit was gone, incinerated completely, leaving him standing in what appeared to be some kind of flexible underlayer that clung to his form, already burning away in several places to reveal the pale skin beneath. Burns covered his exposed flesh, second and third degree by any medical standard, the kind of injuries that should have sent any sentient being into immediate shock. Blood ran freely from his nose and ears, biological responses to the pressure wave that had followed the plasma impacts. Yet he stood. Yet he moved. And yet he still wore that terrible, knowing smile. The human's voice, when he spoke again, was rougher now, strained by damaged tissue in his throat, but no less clear. "Is that really all you've got? We expected better from the great Cretan hegemony. Our intelligence reports must have been wrong." Krelin logical processing centers struggled to reconcile sensory input with known reality. The human should be dead. There was no debate on this point, no room for interpretation. The laws of physics that govern the entire universe didn't simply suspend themselves for one species on one backwater planet in an unremarkable spiral arm of an ordinary galaxy. Yet here stood proof that something was wrong, that some variable had not been accounted for, that the Cretans' understanding of human biology was not merely incomplete, but catastrophically inadequate. The subcommander accessed his suit's medical scanner, directing it to perform a full-spectrum analysis of the human before him. The results that flooded his helmet display made no sense. The human skeletal structure was fracturing under the stress of the plasma impacts, microfractures spreading through bones that should have been pulverized entirely, yet those same bones were also showing signs of accelerated cellular regeneration at rates that violated every principle of biochemistry Krelin had ever studied. The human's cardiovascular system was operating at pressures that should have ruptured arterial walls, pumping blood so saturated with oxygen and adrenaline and half a dozen other compounds that it might as well have been an entirely different substance. His muscle tissue was tearing itself apart and rebuilding simultaneously, fibers contracting with force measurements that exceeded the theoretical maximums for carbon-based biology. and his neural activity, the scanner showed brain function that resembled a feedback loop, pain signals being processed and converted into something else, something that looked biochemically similar to the reward pathways associated with pleasure and satisfaction. The human wasn't just enduring the damage, he was metabolizing it, transforming trauma into fuel for some kind of biological engine that the Cretan scientists had never imagined could exist. Krellenake broadcast an emergency tactical update to the Endless Dominion, his voice tight with something uncomfortably close to fear. "Commander Zalthor, we have encountered an anomaly. Requesting immediate reinforcement and authorization to retreat." On the observation deck, Zalthor stared at the data streaming from Krellenake's suit, his mind rejecting what his eyes clearly showed. In 600 cycles of military service, he'd never issued a retreat order during a boarding action. The very concept was antithetical to Cretan doctrine, an admission of weakness that could undermine the psychological warfare that formed the foundation of their imperial expansion. Yet he was also a pragmatist who'd survived this long by recognizing when conventional tactics no longer applied. Before he could respond, the human in the corridor moved. Not the slow, deliberate step of before, but an explosive burst of speed that closed the distance between him and the nearest Cretan trooper in less time than Krellenake's enhanced reflexes could process. The human's fist, wrapped in the burning remnants of his underlayer, connected with the trooper's chest plate with enough force to crumple the reinforced exoskeleton like paper. The Cretan flew backwards, his 300-pound armored form ragdolling through the air to crash into the bulkhead 15 meters away, his vital signs flatly immediately. The corridor erupted into chaos as 11 remaining Cretans opened fire at point-blank range, their plasma rifles set to maximum output, their tactical discipline abandoned in favor of pure survival instinct. The human twisted between the bolts with movements that seemed to anticipate where each shot would be before the triggers were pulled, his damaged body moving with a fluidity that made a mockery of his injuries. When he couldn't dodge, he simply accepted the hits, each impact burning away more flesh, each wound adding to the growing catalog of damage that should have killed him a dozen times over. But with each hit, he also grew faster, as if his body was learning, adapting, optimizing itself in real time to become a more perfect instrument of violence. He reached the second trooper and drove his elbow into the joint where the helmet met the neck seal, the precision of the strike suggesting either incredible luck or an intimate knowledge of Cretan armor weaknesses that no human should possess. The helmet tore free with a spray of pressurized atmosphere and biological fluids, and the trooper dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The human turned to face the remaining 9, and Krellenake finally saw past the blood and burns and damage to recognize what should have been obvious from the beginning. This wasn't a human defending his ship out of desperation or patriotic duty. This was a human who'd chosen to be here, who'd positioned himself in this exact corridor, at this exact junction, and waited for them to arrive. This was a human who was hunting them. The realization hit Krellenake with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't boarded a human vessel, they'd walked into a carefully prepared kill zone, and the prey they thought cornered was actually the predator springing its trap. Commander Zalthor watched the tactical feat of Krellenake's helmet plate growing forward, his faith in Cretan military supremacy crumbling with each passing second. The boarding team was being systematically dismantled by a single unarmed, grievously wounded human who by all rights should have been a corpse within the first 30 seconds of contact. The rest of the bridge crew had gone silent, their usual efficient chatter dying away as they too observed something that rewrote their understanding of what was possible in combat. The Cretans had conquered hundreds of species, had faced warriors bred for combat, had overcome technological advantages and numerical superiorities through superior tactics and unwavering discipline. But they'd never faced anything like this, an enemy that seemed to grow stronger as it sustained damage, that transformed pain into fuel, that laughed in the face of weapons designed to end life instantaneously. In the human ship's corridor, Krellin aka made the only decision his training allowed. He ordered a fighting retreat back to the breach point, back to the safety of the endless dominion, where superior numbers and heavier weapons could be brought to bear. The remaining 8 troopers began moving backwards in a coordinated formation, maintaining suppressing fire on the human, who advanced steadily through the barrage. Plasma bolts that would have reduced a Creathian to constituent atoms scorched the human skin, burned away muscle tissue, exposed bone in several places along his arms and torso. His left eye was gone, destroyed by a shot that had caught him in the side of the face, the socket a ruined mess of cauterized flesh. Yet he kept coming, kept moving forward with the inexorability of a stellar object, his remaining eye locked on Krellin aka with an intensity that felt personal despite the sub-commander's certainty that they'd never encountered each other before this moment. The tactical withdrawal was proceeding according to doctrine, the troopers covering each other in pairs, maintaining overlapping fields of fire, doing everything correctly by the standards that had served the Creathian military for generations. But those standards had been developed fighting enemies that followed the same basic rules of biology and physics that the Creathians themselves obeyed. Those standards had never accounted for an opponent who could sustain injuries that would kill a Creathian 5 times over and still possess not only the capacity but the will to continue fighting. The human closed the distance again, moving with a lurching, damaged gait that should have been easy to predict and counter, yet somehow he was always exactly where he needed to be, always positioned to exploit the fraction of a second gaps in the Creathian formation. His right hand shot out and grabbed the barrel of the nearest trooper's plasma rifle, and the metal glowed white-hot where his flesh made contact, the smell of burning human tissue flooding the corridor's compromised atmosphere. The human yanked the weapon from the trooper's grip with strength that shouldn't have existed in arms so visibly damaged, then swung the rifle like a club, smashing it into the helmet of a second trooper with enough force to crack the reinforced faceplate. Before either could recover, the human dropped the rifle and drove his burned hand through the first trooper's chest plate, the exoskeleton's composite armor offering no more resistance than wet cardboard. The trooper's vital signs ceased immediately, and the human pulled his arm free, trailing mechanical components and biological matter, using the momentum to spin and deliver a kick to the second trooper's knee joint that bent it backward with an audible crack of braking machinery. The formation collapsed into a chaotic melee, all pretense of tactical discipline abandoned, as the remaining 6 troopers fought for survival against an enemy that physics insisted shouldn't exist. Krellin aka emptied his rifle's power cell into the human's chest at point-blank range, the sustained beam boring a hole completely through the human's torso, the edges of the wound cauterized instantly by temperatures exceeding the surface of a star. Through the hole in the human's chest, Krellin aka could see the corridor wall behind him, could see the human spine and internal organs, could see the extent of damage that should have been instantly fatal. The human looked down at himself, at the fist-sized tunnel through his chest cavity, and the laugh that emerged from his throat was wet and broken, and somehow more terrible than before. He reached up with both hands and grabbed Krellin aka's rifle, pulling himself forward along the beam even as it continued to burn through his palms, and grabbed the sub-commander by the throat with strength that crumpled the reinforced neck seal of his armor. In the moment before Krellin aka's vision went dark, he saw something in the human's remaining eye that his translator unit couldn't process. Not hatred, not rage, but a kind of grim satisfaction, the look of someone who'd proven a point that needed proving, who delivered a message that needed delivering. On the observation deck of the Endless Dominion, Commander Zalthor severed the connection between the ships, the magnetic clamps releasing with explosive force that sent the human vessel spinning away into the debris field. The boarding team was lost, all 12 troopers dead or incapacitated, their sacrifice buying nothing except the knowledge that everything the Cretan hegemony believed about humanity was catastrophically wrong. Zalthor ordered the weapons officers to target the human ship, to reduce it to atoms, to erase this nightmare from existence. But before the order could be executed, his communications officer reported incoming transmissions from the human vessel, broad-spectrum broadcasts on every frequency the Cretans used for military communications. The message was simple, delivered in flawless Cretan by a voice that Zalthor recognized as belonging to the human who just slaughtered an entire boarding team. "We are humanity, and we are coming for you. Tell your hegemony. Tell your fleets. Tell your governments. Tell them that Earth has decided you've taken enough from this galaxy." The transmission included data packages, visual records from the human ship's internal camera showing the boarding action from multiple angles, showing in excruciating detail how a single wounded human had systematically destroyed 12 of the Cretan military's finest warriors. The recordings were being transmitted not just to the endless Dominion, but to every Cretan military vessel within 100 light years, an intelligence coup that would spread through the hegemony like wildfire, undermining the psychological foundation of their imperial expansion. Zalthor realized with sick certainty that this had been the objective all along, not to win this particular engagement, but to send a message that would echo across the stars, to demonstrate that humanity was not like the other species the Cretans had conquered, that the mathematics of despair didn't apply, that Earth's children would not go quietly into subjugation. The commander gave the order to fire, and the endless Dominion's main plasma cannons obliterated the human vessel in a flash of light that briefly outshone the dying red giant. But the message had already been sent, the recordings already distributed, the psychological damage already inflicted. And as the endless Dominion turned away from the debris field and began calculating the jump coordinates back to Cretan space, Zalthor knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't an ending but a beginning, that somewhere in this galaxy, humanity was preparing for war, and that the Cretan hegemony had just learned the most expensive lesson in their 600-cycle history, that some species don't break, don't surrender, don't accept the inevitable. Some species look at overwhelming odds and impossible circumstances and respond not with fear, but with defiant laughter. Some species were called human, and they were coming.
Soldiers, the time for hesitation is over. Our enemies advance, and we must strike victory in them all. Act now!
To hold 200 senior military officers. But today, it felt claustrophobic despite being filled to only half capacity. Holographic displays floated throughout the space, each one showing a different angle of the corridor fight that had taken place 6 cycles ago, the engagement that had already been viewed billions of times across every military installation in the hegemony. Fleet Admiral Troction stood at the center of the chamber, her 4 eyes taking in the assembled officers, noting the way their postures had changed since the recordings had first circulated, the subtle shifts in confidence that no amount of discipline could completely conceal. She'd spent 4 decades building the Cretan military into the most feared force in the known galaxy, had personally overseen the conquest of 37 systems, had authored the strategic doctrine that made resistance futile for every species they'd encountered. Until now. The recording played again, because it needed to be studied, needed to be understood, needed to be absorbed until every officer in the room could recite every detail from memory. The human appeared on screen, bloodied and alone, standing in a junction that tactical analysis had confirmed was the optimal defensive position within that particular ship configuration. The first plasma strike hit him, and the assembled officers who'd never seen the footage before made sounds of disbelief, their translator units struggling to find appropriate Cretan words for the concepts of impossible and abomination. The human laughed, and the sound carried clearly through the briefing chamber's enhanced audio systems, and Troction watched as experienced combat veterans flinched from a noise, from a simple vocalization that should have held no power over them. But they understood now, in a way they hadn't before, that the laugh wasn't just defiance or bravado, but a weapon in itself, a psychological assault designed to undermine the enemy's certainty, to introduce doubt into minds conditioned for absolute confidence. The footage continued, showing the sustained plasma fire that should have vaporized the human a dozen times over, showing his impossible endurance, his terrible strength, his complete disregard for the fundamental laws that govern biological existence. Trokshin paused the recording at the moment when the human grabbed Subcommander Krelnik by the throat, freezing the image so that everyone could see the hole through the human's chest, could see the extent of damage sustained, could see the physical impossibility of what they were witnessing. She spoke then, her voice carrying the weight of authority earned through centuries of successful campaigns. Our xenobiologists have analyzed every frame of this encounter. The human specimen designated Target Alpha sustained injuries that would have killed any known biological entity between 7 and 9 times over, depending on which injury cascade you consider lethal first. Yet he remained combat effective for approximately 4.6 minutes after the initial contact, during which time he terminated 12 elite boarding specialists. The officer shifted, uncomfortable with the clinical language that tried to reduce horror into comprehensible metrics. Trokshin continued, because they needed to hear this, needed to understand the scope of what they faced. Initial assessments suggested genetic modification or cybernetic enhancement, but detailed analysis has ruled out both possibilities. Target Alpha was biologically baseline human, unmodified, operating on nothing more than the standard physiological parameters his species evolved with on their homeworld. The xenobiology team's conclusion is that humans possess a cascade of survival mechanisms that activate under extreme stress, mechanisms that include but are not limited to dramatically increased cardiovascular efficiency, pain signal repurposing, accelerated cellular regeneration, enhanced neurological processing, and what appears to be voluntary control over autonomic functions that should be entirely involuntary. In essence, when a human is sufficiently motivated and sufficiently damaged, their body transforms into something closer to a biological weapon system than a standard organism. One of the younger officers, a tactical specialist who distinguished himself in the conquest of the viral system, raised a foreclaw for recognition. Trokshin acknowledged him, and he asked the question that everyone was thinking. Fleet Admiral, if this is baseline human capability, why have our intelligence services not identified this threat earlier? We've been monitoring Earth for 30 cycles, observing their conflicts, assessing their technological development. Nothing in our databases suggests they possess this level of combat effectiveness. Trokshin had been waiting for this question, had prepared for it, because it struck at the heart of the hegemony's intelligence failure. She brought up a new holographic display, this one showing statistical analysis of human military history. Our intelligence services made a catastrophic error in interpretation. They observed human warfare and noted the high casualty rates, the apparent fragility of human soldiers on battlefields dominated by projectile weapons and explosive devices. They concluded that humans were weak, easily damaged, easily killed. What they failed to recognize was that humans don't design their warfare around maximizing individual survivability. They design it around maximizing collective lethality, accepting individual casualties as the price of strategic victory. The display shifted, showing human combat footage from their own historical archives, soldiers advancing through conditions that would have sent any rational species into full retreat, accepting casualties that by Cretan standards represented military collapse, yet continuing to fight with undiminished effectiveness. Trokshin highlighted specific examples. Here, human soldiers advance through chemical weapons that are dissolving their respiratory systems, yet they continue fighting for hours before succumbing. Here, a human continues combat operations for 17 minutes after sustaining injuries our medical databases classify as instantly incapacitating. Here, a human unit loses 70% casualties yet successfully completes their objective and retreats in good order. Our analysts saw this data and concluded humans were desperate or poorly commanded or both. They never considered the alternative, that humans are simply built different, that their baseline tolerances for damage and pain exceed our theoretical models for biological possibility, and that they've spent their entire evolutionary history learning to weaponize those tolerances. The briefing chamber fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled officers like a physical weight. If one baseline human could destroy a Cretan boarding team, what could a company of humans accomplish? What could a battalion do? What could an entire military force comprised of these impossible creatures achieve if properly motivated and directed toward the hegemony? Troction provided the answer they weren't ready to hear. Our Strategic Analysis Division has run comprehensive simulations based on revised human capability assessments. In a conventional military engagement with current force dispositions, the Cretan hegemony would achieve victory over Earth at an estimated casualty ratio of 8-1, possibly as high as 12-1. That means for every human soldier we kill, we lose between 8 and 12 Cretan warriors. Across a planetary invasion scenario, we're looking at potentially 60 to 70% casualties among our invasion forces before achieving strategic objectives. And that's assuming the humans don't employ asymmetric tactics or develop new weapon systems specifically designed to exploit our weaknesses. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment, like a death sentence for the hegemony's expansionist doctrine. Every military professional in the chamber understood what those casualty ratios meant: Pyrrhic victories that would bleed the Cretan military to the point of collapse, conquests that cost more than they could ever yield, strategic positions purchased with losses that could never be replaced. One of the senior fleet commanders, a veteran of 80 successful campaigns, stood and addressed Troction directly. "Fleet Admiral, are you suggesting we abandon our expansion into human-controlled space? That we simply cede an entire region of the galaxy to a species that numbers fewer than 20 billion individuals and controls barely a dozen star systems?" Troction met his gaze with her 4 eyes, her expression carved from stone. "No, Commander. I'm suggesting something far more radical. I'm suggesting we talk to them." The
Team, we are approaching the planet. The mission is critical. Understood, Commander. We must be ready for anything.
Like this one. Constructed by the Galactic Concordat as a venue for resolving disputes between spacefaring species, the station's translucent observation chambers offered views of the planet below, a world of azure oceans and emerald continents that had never known war, never been claimed by any empire, existing as a symbol of what cooperation rather than conquest could achieve. Fleet Admiral Troction stood in one such chamber, watching the human diplomatic vessel approach through the view screen, noting its clean lines and efficient design, seeing now what her intelligence analysts had failed to recognize before, that humans built their ships not for comfort or aesthetics, but for function, every component optimized for specific purposes, including purposes that involved violence when diplomacy failed. The human delegation consisted of 3 individuals, deliberately small in number to avoid any appearance of military posturing, though Troction suspected that even 3 humans might represent a significant threat if circumstances deteriorated. The lead diplomat was a female designated Ambassador Sarah Chen, her personnel file indicating 40 years of service in Earth's diplomatic corps, fluent in 7 human languages and 3 alien ones, with a reputation for directness that some species found refreshing and others found offensive. She entered the observation chamber with 2 aides, and Troction noted the way they moved, the controlled grace that she now recognized as the careful movement of predators in unfamiliar territory, every gesture economical, every step positioned for optimal balance and reaction time. Ambassador Chen extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting, and Trokshin clasped it briefly, noting the strength in those fingers, the warmth of mammalian blood pumping through a cardiovascular system capable of impossible feats. They settled into the negotiation space, humans on one side of the crystalline table, Creathians on the other, the gulf between their species represented by meters of polished stone that seemed simultaneously too vast and not nearly vast enough. Ambassador Chen spoke first, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who'd negotiated countless agreements. Fleet Admiral Trokshin, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I understand that recent events have created tension between our peoples, and Earth's government is committed to finding a peaceful resolution if one exists. Trokshin appreciated the carefully chosen words, the acknowledgement of tension without assigning blame, the offer of peace without the weakness of pleading. She responded in kind. Ambassador Chen, the Creathian hegemony values stability and predictability in interstellar relations. Recent events have demonstrated that our understanding of human capabilities was incomplete. We seek to correct this deficiency and establish parameters for coexistence that benefit both our species. The translation units worked flawlessly, but Trokshin knew that the real communication happening in this room went beyond words, beyond language, into the realm of posture and implication and the unspoken calculations that determined whether species lived in peace or died in war. Ambassador Chen leaned back in her chair, a gesture that human body language databases indicated suggested confidence and comfort, though Trokshin suspected it was a carefully calculated display. Let me be direct, Fleet Admiral, because I think both our species value directness. The incident with your boarding team was tragic and avoidable. The individual you encountered, the one your reports designate Target Alpha, was Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, a combat engineer who'd been alone on that ship for 6 days after the rest of his crew evacuated following the initial engagement. He was exhausted, injured, and operating on the edge of human physiological limits even before your team breached his vessel. What you witnessed wasn't standard human capability. It was an extreme stress response triggered by circumstances that pushed him into what we call the red zone, a state of heightened function that comes at severe physiological cost. Trokshin considered this explanation, weighing it against the data her analysts had compiled, searching for deception or misdirection. One of her aides, a military intelligence specialist, interjected. Ambassador, our medical scans of Target Alpha of Lieutenant Hayes showed no evidence of advanced cybernetics or genetic modification. Are you claiming that what we observed was purely biological, a natural human stress response? Ambassador Chen nodded, and something in her expression suggested she understood the fear this admission would create. Yes, exactly that. Humans evolved as persistence hunters on Earth, creatures who survived not through superior strength or speed but through the ability to keep going long after our prey collapsed from exhaustion. Our bodies developed mechanisms to override pain, to suppress damage signals, to keep functioning far past the point where rational animals would surrender to death. In modern humans, those mechanisms mostly lie dormant, activated only in the most extreme circumstances. Lieutenant Hayes encountered those circumstances. The Creathian delegation exchanged glances, their translator units struggling with the concept of evolutionary adaptation specifically designed for the purpose of refusing to die. Trokshin asked the question that needed asking. What happened to Lieutenant Hayes after the engagement ended, after Commander Zalthor destroyed his vessel? Ambassador Chen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that suggested genuine emotion breaking through diplomatic composure. He died, Fleet Admiral. The damage he sustained was catastrophic, far beyond what human medical technology could repair even if we'd been able to recover him immediately. Our analysis suggests he remained conscious and combat effective for approximately 6 minutes after your boarding team first engaged him, and then lived for perhaps another 3 to 4 minutes before his injuries finally overwhelmed his body's compensatory mechanisms. He knew he was dying, knew that every second he fought was being purchased with pieces of his life, and he chose to spend those seconds sending a message that Earth needed your hegemony to hear. The observation chamber fell silent, the weight of that sacrifice settling over both delegations like a physical presence. Troxan had commanded soldiers who'd given their lives for the hegemony, had written commendations for warriors who'd chosen duty over survival, but the cold calculation of Hayes' decision, the deliberate transformation of his own dying moments into a weapon of psychological warfare, spoke to a level of species-wide ruthlessness that the Creathians had never encountered before. She asked, quietly, "What was the message, Ambassador? What did Lieutenant Hayes die to tell us?" Ambassador Chen met her gaze with eyes that had seen too many wars, too many negotiations that failed, too many moments where peace hung by threads too delicate to survive contact with reality. That humanity will not be conquered. That we'd rather die to the last child on the last world than accept subjugation. That if the Creathian hegemony wants Earth, the price will be measured in billions of casualties on both sides, in centuries of grinding warfare, in the complete collapse of interstellar civilization in this entire region of the galaxy. Lieutenant Hayes died to give you a choice, Fleet Admiral: coexist with us as equals, or try to conquer us and watch your hegemony burn. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, like a promise of apocalypse, like a choice that would determine the fate of two species and everyone caught between them. Troxan looked out the observation window at the peaceful world below, at Kesthar with its untouched continents and pristine oceans, and she thought about Lieutenant Marcus Hayes laughing in a corridor as plasma bolts burned through his chest, thought about the mathematics of conquest when the enemy refused to acknowledge that they'd been conquered, thought about the price of empire when the territory you claimed cost more than it could ever be worth. She turned back to Ambassador Chen, and in that moment, Fleet Admiral Troxan made the decision that would define the rest of her career and possibly save the Creathian hegemony from its own expansionist ambitions. Then let us discuss the terms of coexistence, Ambassador. Let us find a way forward that honors Lieutenant Hayes' sacrifice by ensuring it was the last such sacrifice necessary. Let us prove that even species as different as ours can learn from each other, can respect each other's sovereignty, can build something better than endless war. Ambassador Chen extended her hand again, and this time when Troxan clasped it, she felt not the grip of an enemy, but the grasp of someone who'd walked to the edge of the abyss and stepped back, someone who'd stared into the darkness of total war and chosen the difficult path of peace instead. They talked for hours, laying the groundwork for treaties that would take years to finalize, establishing boundaries and protocols and mutual defense agreements that transformed the Creathian hegemony's relationship with humanity from one of predator and prey to one of wary neighbors, who respected each other's capacity for violence precisely because they'd both proven they could exercise that violence if necessary. And in the months and years that followed, as the agreement solidified and the borders stabilized and the two species learned to coexist, the story of Lieutenant Marcus Hayes spread through both civilizations, told differently by each side but carrying the same essential truth, that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through conquest but through the courage to stand firm, to refuse surrender, to laugh in the face of impossible odds, and dare the universe to prove you wrong. Humanity had sent its message to the stars, and the stars had listened.